Hello, and welcome to another one of the occasional Vermont Employee Ownership Center conversations with people doing interesting things in the employee ownership world. Today, I'm really excited to have Nathan Schneider with us, who is a journalist and assistant professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he leads the Media Enterprise Design Lab and wrote his most recent book is Everything for Everyone, the Radical Tradition that is Shaping the Next Economy, which is a really enjoyable tour of a variety of initiatives around kind of ownership and democracy and collaboration. Everything from kind of old style kind of co-ops and monasticism to blockchain and the kind of latest platform technology that's kind of one of the big transformative forces in the world of work right now. So Nathan, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
So we've known each other for a few years in a variety of contexts. I think kind of initially, I became aware of your work around the sort of platform cooperativism stuff. But do you want to give kind of a little further background as to what's led you down this path? And then also one other kind of interesting piece around is that you've been digging into the work recently of Louis Kelso, who is the kind of originator of the employee stock ownership plan or ESOP model. But you want to give a little backstory?
Yeah, sure. So I've been, since the beginning of the financial crisis of 2008, the kind of defining economic event of my generation. I've been covering resistance movements. Behind me, I see in the reflection is the original magazine centerfold that called for Occupy Wall Street. That was my book before this was an account of that protest. And so I spent a lot of time looking at people who were resisting the existing financial model, and that kind of led me into people who are trying to build alternatives and really the much broader tradition that they are building on, and it just keeps on expanding. And most recently, I've been really interested in some of the ways in which change has happened in the United States to enable more dramatic expansions of shared ownership, of democratic ownership. So this comes about because, as you mentioned, this platform cooperativism universe is, a community of people around the world who are trying to build cooperatives and similar sorts of companies for the online economy. So imagine a kind of Uber owned by its drivers or that sort of thing. Facebook that, rather than being owned and, essentially controlled by one person, actually be accountable to its users. But this, it turns out, is really hard. Companies that are trying to do this, including some really visionary, very competent startups, really have trouble getting off the ground. They can't access financing, that everything is just kind of stacked against them. And so that frustration and my kind of accompaniment of these startups has led me to try to figure out how is it that people in the past have done this. So that's made me spend a lot of time learning about how farmers developed the farm credit system that's now led to the $130 billion co-bank down the road from me in Denver, or the development of the credit union system, which Matt, you're a much greater expert on than I am, and a further advance is the development of the ESOP. I mean, we've, for instance, had worker cooperatives throughout American history in different forms, but it's generally been a very small tradition. And today we have in the range of a few hundred worker cooperatives. But whereas ESOPs, it's a different kind of model, but there are some similarities. And, this is a model that has reached, at least to some degree, 14 million Americans on the order of several thousand companies. And so that kind of posed to me a challenge of how did that happen? How did a series of fairly modest legal interventions, legislative interventions, starting especially in 1974, bring about a significant expansion in worker ownership, and what lessons can we draw from that legacy today? And also, the more I got into exploring that question too, I got very interested in the broader vision of Louis Kelso and his collaborators, and recognizing that they didn't really intend to just stop at the ESOP. He may be best known for that innovation, but actually had a much broader vision for what he understood as a kind of democratic capitalism that looks toward a really wholesale restructuring of how ownership happens in the economy, that I think is also quite interesting too, and it poses a challenge to us to ask, what is the next step, rather than just how can we defend and enable the persistence of the ESOP. What is the next step that we want to take in the direction that the ESOP points?
So, but before we get into that, the sort of looking forward and thinking about what's possible, I think it would be great to go through a little bit as you've been kind of going down this rabbit hole of the history of all of this stuff. I think a lot of, even in the kind of current employee ownership movement, and this is true of a lot of kind of sectors that kind of have this origin story, and you get little thumbnail history of it, and that's about it in terms of the understanding of the past and origins. But can you talk a little bit about sort of how you kind of first engaged with this, and then sort of what you found in terms of that kind of the development of this model and approach to kind of economic organizing and the economy?
Sure. Well, Louis Kelso, for instance, you could start here, did his university education, both undergrad and law school, here at the University of Colorado. And during that time, kind of in the tail end of the Depression, was very interested in kind of big macroeconomic questions, and developed this kind of rough, kind of folk, fairly eccentric theory around the role of labor and capital, and kind of expected that with greater automation, the importance of labor in the economy would decline and capital would become important. So in order to prevent this from turning into a kind of feudal nightmare, you would need to expand people's access to capital. And he started, as he became a corporate lawyer and made some money and started making his way, especially in San Francisco, he discovered some mechanisms for this, really by observing how the rich operate. When they make capital investments, they don't tend to spend their own cash to do it. They tend to borrow money on the strength of their cash, right? Their richness enables them to essentially make capital investments without actually making significant risks on their own part in many cases. And so working as a corporate lawyer in San Francisco, he saw this kind of pattern and saw over and over ways in which the rich could do things that that ordinary people really couldn't do, and that we're really talking about two totally different economies between those who are working in the realm of capital and those who are working in the realm of labor. And so the ESOP was an early experiment to try to bring capital ownership to more people, in particular people who are working at the company. And so, for instance, an early experiment in the mid-50s, he was involved with a Bay Area newspaper chain called Peninsula Papers that included the Palo Alto Times, which actually one of my colleagues was in journalism here, was a reporter at. And they were trying to figure out what to do with this. They're having a succession crisis, and he, helped them develop a means of transferring ownership to the workers. And it worked out really nicely. It actually paid back the loan ahead of time, and it all kind of panned out. And so he started doing more and more of these experiments over the 50s and 60s, and trying to interest politicians in this. He was a Republican for much of his life, and he was mainly trying to interest Republican politicians, and there was some interest and so forth. And then finally, in the early 70s, he got to know Senator Long of Louisiana, who was a kind of centrist Southern Democrat, and Long really got it and saw an opportunity arising in the context of ERISA, a major reform in the retirement and employment law. And actually, in that moment, Kelso didn't like that idea. He didn't want this to be just a retirement plan. He wanted it to involve ongoing profit sharing and so forth. But Kelso stressed, this is a tremendous political moment. We can't pass this up. This is the opportunity. And so they took it. And, that's how, the ESOP became a retirement plan as far as US law saw it. And that had certain benefits. For instance, it enabled retirement contributions from the company to be used to pay back those loans, which is a tremendous benefit for the ESOP. There were some further policy changes after 1974, relating to public companies and so forth. So there was a kind of ongoing effort. But nevertheless, it was that kind of relatively small opportunity that created not just the possibility of an ESOP, but I think it's also important to emphasize a market for the ESOP, right? Part of the motivating factor for creating ESOPs is that actually there are a range of service providers who can benefit from doing this. So Kelso was a lawyer. It's probably without, not an accident that he created a kind of structure that, you need some lawyers to do, and that your lawyers, might actually see some benefit for themselves in doing. And bankers started to kind of like it. He himself also became an investment banker. That bankers started realizing, hey, there's some really nice tax benefits here. The interest payments on these loans are tax deductible. Oh, this is pretty cool, or tax free. So let's get involved in this business. And having those kinds of service providers see value for themselves in participating in this new model, I think it also enabled it to not just exist but actually take off.
And so from there, we saw the kind of explosion of the ESOP model in terms of number of participants and impact, and that's been kind of a story of little bits of ups and downs over the years. But I think the latest estimate somewhere in the neighborhood of like 6,000 ESOPs and more than 10 million participants. So it's been a pretty impactful model. But it's you mentioned earlier it was kind of from Kelso's vision of it, kind of a piece of a larger kind of agenda and framework. And so, it kind of, in some ways, do you have any thoughts on kind of why that became the particular piece of the puzzle that was kind of implemented and made successful, and sort of what are the other pieces there that he developed, and
Right.
sort of what was their role, and how, in some ways were they supposed to fit together into a larger system?
Well, it's funny. It's when you look at the jacket copy of his first book, which he co-authored with Mortimer Adler, who was a kind of famous popular philosopher at the time, right? The copy was kind of like, presumably written by the publishers, was like, you may think that the economy is working really well for the American worker right now, but these people warn that, dark clouds may be on the horizon. It's really striking to me reading that, such a jacket copy would be utterly unnecessary through my entire adult life. I've lived, so many of us are just so used to the idea that we all know this stuff is broken. And, the question is, are we going to fix it, or are we just going to let it stay broken? But that was a moment where actually, wages were tracking with productivity, where there was a lot of reason to think that, like, actually labor was doing pretty well. And so I think that the strategy of starting with the workplace as people's cultural and economic kind of hub of kind of bulwark of stability, still at a time when people could expect to have, one employer for the majority of their career, It was just kind of a natural stakeholder relationship. At the same time, he actually was experimenting with another model that he called the CSOP, the Consumer Stock Ownership Plan, which was a model. He tested it out with a Colorado fertilizer or a California fertilizer, essentially a kind of purchasing cooperative for fertilizer among farmers, but where the consumers of a business would be the owners. So rather than being the owner of the employer who's paying you, you're the owner of the business that you're frequently a customer at. And he imagined this applying to, for instance, grocery stores and utility companies. And actually, this model is now being implemented at last in the European Union, where some really exciting new legislation is moving forward that essentially applies the ESOP to renewable energy development, facilitating community ownership of new energy utilities. So, but actually, if you look at that first book, The New Capitalists, it barely mentions employee ownership at all. Or sorry, that was the second. The first book was called The Capitalist Manifesto. It barely mentions the employee ownership at all. It really focuses on a proposal for creating a leveraged purchasing plan, enabling every ordinary person to buy stock in, essentially, buy a stake in the American economy without having to put up their own cash. And so it's kind of a broad-based kind of index fund type of approach. And then at the end of his life, his final book with his wife and collaborator, Patricia Heder Kelso, the book was subtitled Extending the ESOP Revolution. And so they're drawing on the success of the ESOP, but they actually have 8 plans for different ways in which people could own and have these leveraged ownership stakes in pieces of the economy. And these include models where people would become like co-owners of big infrastructure projects in their area. Like, say they built a bridge down the road, maybe everybody in the area becomes a stakeholder in that bridge. They talk about commercial real estate co-ownership. They talk about treating home ownership actually as more of a business investment, and using kind of business credit mechanisms. And at the core of this too, they propose a new kind of insurance corporation, a federal entity that they call the Capital Diffusion Reinsurance Corporation. And it's a kind of Freddie, Fannie, or FDIC type entity that helps create a market for this kind of capitalism of the masses by underwriting these loans that facilitate these capital buyouts. So it was this vision in which everybody would be a co-owner of significant chunks of the economy, and more of the income of more people would come from capital rather than labor. And so jobs would become less important in our lives ultimately, that our ownership stake would become our dominant economic participation. And so in a way, it's kind of ironic that the ESOP was, what they in that last book called the Trojan horse of this effort, because the ESOP kind of reinforces the importance of labor in certain respects, where actually their vision was toward a kind of society in which capital might actually eclipse labor as the dominant factor in our economic lives.
So, one question that occurs to me as you've been thinking about this, and also with all the work you've done on kind of the cooperative movement model as well, is you're talking about the CSOP, right? You have kind of this, you're spending money and building equity in the business that's meeting your needs as a consumer. With the ESOP, you're contributing labor and receiving kind of equity as part of in the company workforce, part of the compensation. The kind of parallels in the co-op world are sort of the worker co-op and the consumer co-op, right? Which using the kind of that patronage mechanism. Yeah. So in your kind of like thinking and exploring these models, what do you see as kind of sort of key differences or similarities, or what is it that differentiates these as kind of cousin approaches to this question of cultivating broad-based capital ownership?
Well, there are two. It's a great question, and it's something I know you have insights on too. I mean, the core difference in structure is that a cooperative is a kind of company, and an ESOP operates as a trust within another kind of company. So that is, there are differences that emerge from those. For instance, the nice thing about an ESOP potentially is that it can operate within a company that already has some kind of PAP dependency, that has operated, under a certain ownership and has already, certain investment and kind of cap table that can't fully be changed into a totally different kind of company.
So it can be kind of a gradualist.
Exactly. And the ESOP very much kind of works within the existing system, presumes the logic of capital ownership and also capital maximization, especially in how the legislation constrains the requirements of the trustee to, kind of maximize the benefit for workers. Now, you could also have, and there's growing interest now in different kinds of trusts that aren't ESOPs, like they call them EOTs, employee ownership trusts, that are a little more flexible than the ESOP, aren't a retirement plan, but they don't have the tax benefits of the ESOP yet, maybe. A cooperative is a much less kind of, it is a creature that works less in the realm of capitalism, potentially. The stock is not a speculative asset. It doesn't go up and down based on market value. It has a kind of different character, and it naturally has some governance rights attached to it, which is not necessarily the case in the ESOP. Now, one thing that interests me here is, for instance, I've gone to large worker cooperatives in Italy where significant portions of the workers are not members of the cooperative, where governance is a fairly elitist and conventional activity, and nevertheless, the cooperative is a significant portion of the business's identity, and it really matters. But it doesn't look all that different from a large, from a comparably sized ESOP to a certain degree. So I'm very interested in the points of encounter, and also at the same time, you go to ESOP conferences now and you hear about tax stuff, and then you also hear about open book management, right? So we see more and more ESOPs seeing the value in leveraging their co-ownership by involving more participatory governance, even though they don't legally have to, that they just find that it really helps, the health of the business and the productivity of the employees. So I see them as being quite distinct in many ways, both culturally and structurally and legally. But I'm very interested in the ways in which the two of these models can converge kind of on the cultural level, and also over time, what happens to a company, when it is, when it deepens its culture and understanding of employee ownership. And how can we actually develop the next wave of structures, ESOP-like structures that learn and incorporate more features of cooperatives? So, for instance, the Next System Project or Democracy Collaborative just put out a report on for-purpose ESOPs. So ESOPs that are also B Corps or benefit corporations. So they have a social purpose encoded into the company as well as being an ESOP. That's one other step toward, the kind of cooperative logic that is able to benefit from the alignments of the ESOP with the kind of capitalist surround, but also integrates more of those cooperative features.
So then that's a good segue into turning towards a little bit of thinking about the future and the opportunities and challenges that we're kind of facing now. So, in terms of the, mid 20th century speculations coming from Kelso, do you see kind of like how accurate or inaccurate, or do you feel like those are given, where we are now? And then what, a lot of your work has been around looking at the platform economy and the sort of transformation of work and all of those things. So if you could kind of go through a little bit about what are the challenges we're facing, what opportunities do you see for these structures and developing structures derived from these structures to sort of meet those challenges.
So Kelso's predictions, the broader predictions were kind of interestingly accurate. For instance, in 1972, Paul Samuelson, recent Nobel Prize winner, first American Nobel Prize winner in economics, penned a, very, very aggressive critique against Kelso, whose ideas were being considered at the time by the government of Puerto Rico. And Samuelson's main accusation was, look, we just don't have evidence that, labor's value, is declining compared to capital. This basic assumption or this basic contention is not happening. And that was actually right about the time when it did start happening. In the mid-70s was where productivity keeps going up and wages flatline, and we're still living in that world where wages just aren't keeping up. And, that has to do with the decline of unions, has to do perhaps with, automation. There are different ways of explaining that. And there are different factors, but nevertheless, that basic bifurcation between labor and capital has occurred. And so to the extent that it has, one option is to try to recoup the returns to labor by raising the minimum wage, which Kelso was an opponent of, actually, something I disagree with him on. Trying to strengthen unions or so forth, or you could go in the direction, as Kelso argued, of trying to democratize capital ownership and ensuring that more people, that everybody has access to that rising tide, and kind of let labor decline as the returns to labor continue flatlining or declining. It is a moment right now. People are very aware that there's a problem. Kelso's diagnosis, I think, deserves fresh, consideration, and so do some of his broader proposals. And so I think that, regardless of what you think of Kelso's work in particular, there are some interesting opportunities for expanding capital ownership into some new sectors, and the online economy is a particularly interesting one. I've been kind of part of this group, as you have been, railing about the need for, users and so forth to be owners for a long time. But actually now we find Uber, Lyft, and Airbnb, like the three horsemen of the gig economy apocalypse, have actually been going to the Securities and Exchange Commission and saying, hey, can we please share ownership with our users? And, I think they're doing this for, utterly self-interested and cynical reasons, but nevertheless, they see value in something like this. And there isn't a structure that could enable quite yet the kind of thing they want to do. Meanwhile, some people, there's a lot of effort, for instance, in California right now, around, maybe the goal should be just to categorize these people as employees and be done with it, make sure they have, full rights of employment and, hand it over to labor, or we could really say, okay, we'll accept that these are contractors, but, that they are also owners, and build ownership much more into the social contract of the online economy. And so I've been exploring this notion of what I call a user trust, which is a kind of ESOP for contractor users of online platforms, and that could, for instance, make it so that in a company like Airbnb, the hosts are benefiting, receiving capital benefits, as stock appreciates or something, alongside investors, and that they're bought in as owners as part of the process. Or in a company like Facebook, where the amount of money that would come to any individual user would be fairly small, probably. Maybe it would be less about income and more about governance. So you would have a trust of shares that would have some governance rights on being able to elect a board member or something, and users would have a say in, within that trust, a governance structure within that trust. So there are different reasons why this might equal different applications. And right now, I'm just beginning the process of trying to spur a conversation of how some of these logics that brought about the ESOP, that enabled the ESOP to function within existing companies, could be applied for, in the short term, for some of the existing challenges that we're facing in the online economy, rather than simply waiting for, or in addition to working toward, building a new generation of, fully cooperative online startups, right? I'm in these cases trying, as the ESOP did, trying to kind of meet the economy where it is and figure out how can we inject maximal democracy into the mess we've inherited.
Yeah, no, it's been amazing to watch the rapid transformation of who are the top 10 biggest firms in the economy and what's their line of business of the
oh yeah,
last decade.
And an important thing to recognize about them too, right, is that when you look at these companies, they're employing an order of magnitude fewer people than the previous generation of the largest firms in the country, right? Google's employing, tens of thousands of people, Facebook, tens of thousands, maybe getting over 100,000. Amazon's got more because it's got these warehouses and so forth. But if you look at, they're still involved in a much larger workforce that's informally associated with the platform than is actually on their books. And so with all these companies, Uber is like a few thousand employees for over 1 million drivers, right? So the proportion is just completely out of whack, and even now the engineers at these big companies are saying, more and more of us are going to become external contractors, and only the top management are going to be the actual employees with all those sweet perks. So we're seeing, a tremendous shift in this new family of top companies from, company as the great American employer to company as an aristocracy employer, aristocratic employer, with a mass of non-employed contractors who have a very, dubious relationship to these platforms, and in a role in which, ownership might be the appropriate way back in, especially when these people are not working, 9 to 5. They're not, they're in many of these cases, not all, they're wanting to be flexible. There's, there are benefits on both sides for stepping outside the traditional employment contract, and ownership can be and perhaps should be part of that contract that we're seeing emerging.
So as we wrap up the conversation, for people who are interested in this kind of work that's happening right now that you're engaged in, what are from your perspective the best ways to get involved? What's the stuff that's kind of most exciting you right now, and what are kind of good next steps to kind of keep this moving forward?
Well, one thing I would really invite the employee ownership world to, first of all, we're in a moment of tremendous political opportunity where we have bipartisan support for expanding employee ownership. We have, leading presidential candidates interested in this stuff. In my state, the governor has just appointed an employee ownership commission. So we're really in a once-in-a-generation moment to move this step forward. Let's not use this just to shore up the existing structures. Let's do that, but also think about what is the next level that we want. What are we pointing toward? That that's a question I would love to see us asking more together, rather than just how can we reinforce these already perfected mechanisms that even their founder thinks was a profound compromise, and how can we continue advancing this? If anybody is interested in exploring, especially some of these models like user trusts, some of these more experimental approaches, I would love to work with you. I've just starting up a lab here at CU Boulder called the Media Enterprise Design Lab that's focused on doing collaborations with folks who are trying to try something different in the business world, and in the activist world, and all these sorts of things, and help connect you with the right people, legal support, and so forth. So if I can be useful, I would love to be. And again, most of all, what I do is help connect people to others who are involved in this work. And we see a growing number of people in finance and law and so forth who are part of this conversation about what is the next phase. How can we really step this this work up into take advantage of this generational opportunity and do something akin to what Kelso did in the 70s, or what happened in the New Deal with the Rural Electrification Act and the credit unions, that not just tweak things up a little bit, but actually initiate a massive wave of democratization in the economy.
Great. Well, with that vision, let's get to work. So, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation, Nathan. And,
of course, thank you, Matt. Thanks to all of you who are involved in this work. It's so important.
So, this has been a project of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. So, doing occasional conversations with folks who are interested in or doing interesting work in the employee ownership space. So, if you know of anyone who you think would be interesting for us to have on, just shoot me an email to matt@veoc.org. Until next time, I'm Matt Cropp, co-executive director. Take care.